Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are not just scratching the surface on a topic. We are performing a full-scale autopsy on a concept that is so deeply embedded in our cultural DNA, I feel like it's printed on the back of our eyelids.
It really is. I mean, it's the phrase that launches 1,000 political campaigns.
Sells millions of SUVs.
And, probably haunts about half the dinner table conversations in this country.
We are talking, of course, about the American dream.
It truly is the national ethos. You could call it the operating system of the United States. It's the story we tell ourselves about who we are and, maybe more importantly, who we could be.
Right. It's the glue that holds a really disparate society together.
That's a great way to put it.
And if I asked you, or if I asked our listener right now to just, close their eyes and picture the American dream, what pops up? I'm guessing it is a very specific mental JPEG.
Oh, yeah. The white picket fence?
The white picket fence, a paid-off mortgage, maybe a golden retriever running in the yard.
2 cars in the driveway?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And crucially, this unshakable idea that you're doing better financially than your parents did. That is the standard issue definition, isn't it?
That is the standard definition today, yes. That is what we might call the consumer American dream. But here is where we have to start with, like a massive historical plot twist.
Okay, all right.
The material definition, the cars, the high wages, all the stuff. The man who actually coined the term the American dream explicitly warned against that interpretation.
Wait, why?
He actually hated it.
So the guy who invented the phrase didn't want it to be about money. That seems completely counterintuitive.
Not primarily about money, no. In fact, he thought that was a corruption of the idea. We need to go back to 1931. The historian's name is James Truslow Adams, and he wrote this book, The Epic of America.
Okay, and the year is key here. 1931.
Context is everything. Think about 1931. We are in the absolute depths of the Great Depression.
Things are bleak. I mean, historically bleak.
Beyond bleak. The stock market has cratered. Unemployment is skyrocketing. You have people literally starving in the streets. The banking system is just collapsing.
And in the middle of this economic apocalypse, he's writing about a dream.
Exactly. And yet, this is when he defines the American dream as, and I'm quoting here, that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone.
Okay, better, richer, and fuller. But usually when we hear richer today, we think bank accounts. We think zeros.
Right, but Adams clarifies this immediately. He writes, and this is like the smoking gun, it is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely.
Merely. So he's not totally excluding it, but he's saying that's not the point.
It's not the core of it. He envisioned a social order where people could attain their fullest stature, become the best versions of themselves. And he actually used the Library of Congress as his visual metaphor for the dream.
The Library of Congress.
Yeah.
Not a bank, not a factory floor.
No, a library. He saw it as a symbol of the dream because it was a place of peaceful, collective, enlightened self-improvement. It was open to everyone, funded by the collective, and dedicated to knowledge. For Adams, the dream was democracy trying to save itself through education and shared understanding, not through just accumulating assets.
That is painfully ironic. We took a concept born in the Great Depression about being more about character and intellect, and we completely mutated into a concept about having more.
Precisely. And that tension, this war between being versus having, or character versus commerce, is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
And we have a ton of material to do it.
We have a massive stack of sources here to help us figure out if this patient is still alive. We've got a brand new 2025 snapshot of American sentiment from the Archbridge Institute.
We also have 50 years of really granular economic mobility data from Opportunity Insights.
And then we're getting into literary critiques of The Great Gatsby and Death of a Salesman, and some very heavy sociological studies on race, debt, and geography.
So the mission for this deep dive is a pulse check. Is the American dream dead? Is it on life support? Or, as some of our sources suggest, is it just mutating into something else entirely because the old version is simply too expensive to afford anymore?
Or, to take the darker path, which we have to explore, was it a segregationist social fabric that was never actually designed for everyone to fit into in the first place?
Right. These are heavy questions, but they need to be asked. So let's start with the vitals. How are people feeling about the dream right now in 2026?
This is why we hit our first real paradox. Because if you just look at the headlines or, scroll social media for 5 minutes, you'd think the dream is dead and buried.
For sure. The vibe is, generally speaking, bad. We have extreme political polarization, economic uncertainty, that whole inflation hangover.
It feels grim. but the Archbridge Institute's 2025 American Dream Snapshot tells a completely different story.
I was genuinely surprised by this data. It shows this incredible resilience.
It really is something. According to this 2025 data, 69% of Americans believe they have either achieved the American dream or are currently on their way to achieving it.
69%. That's nearly 7 out of 10 people.
7 out of 10. And this holds true across income levels, race, and education. It's a remarkably sticky, optimistic belief.
That is a solid majority. But as I was reading through the data, there's a catch. A big one.
There's a massive catch. While 69% feel good about their own prospects,
Right.
only 51% believe that other Americans can achieve the dream.
It's the I'm okay, but you're all doomed syndrome.
Exactly. It's this wild disconnect between personal agency and societal pessimism. We believe in our own ability to hustle and, make it work.
I can pull myself up by my bootstraps.
But the system is broken for everyone else. We've lost faith in the system's ability to deliver for the collective.
And that pessimism, when you break it down by demographics, it gets really interesting.
It does. Both Republicans and Democrats are actually more optimistic than independents, which is a curious finding in itself. Maybe party affiliation gives you a sense of a team that can win.
But the big one is age.
The pessimism is most concentrated in the younger generation. Adults aged 18 to 29 are the most likely to say the dream is out of reach. About 39% of them feel that way.
Which, that intuitively makes sense. They are the ones standing at the bottom of the mountain looking up at astronomical housing costs and crippling student loans.
Absolutely. The math just doesn't seem to work for them in the same way it did for their parents or grandparents.
But even with that pessimism, the majority of young people still believe they can make it, which is amazing. However, we need to contrast this sentiment, this vibe, with the cold, hard economic reality.
Yes. Because while people feel optimistic for themselves, the actual machinery of the dream has been sputtering for decades.
And this brings us to the gold standard of economic data on this topic, the work of Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights. They produced a landmark study on something they call absolute income mobility.
Right. Let's define that really clearly for the listener, because absolute income mobility sounds like something you'd hear in a boring economics lecture.
It does, but it's actually the metric that matters most to families sitting around the kitchen table.
It's very, very simple at its core. Absolute income mobility is the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did.
And it's adjusted for inflation, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
They measure both the parents and the children at age 30 and adjust for inflation. So it's a true apples-to-apples comparison. It is the doing better than dad metric. It's the promise that each generation climbs a little higher on the ladder.
And the trend line is, well, it's not good.
It's a cliff, a slow-motion cliff dive over 50 years. If you were born in 1940, so the early baby boomer generation, you had a 90% chance of earning more than your parents.
90%. It was almost guaranteed.
It was basically the default setting for the American economy. The wind was at your back, you could drop out of high school, get a factory job, and you would likely still out-earn your father, who might have had a similar job.
You practically had to try to fail. The whole economy was like an escalator moving up. You just had to stand still.
Essentially, yes. But if you were born in the 1980s, so the millennials, that number drops to 50%.
From 90 to 50.
It's a coin flip. It is literally a 50-50 chance. Half of that generation is growing up to be poorer than their parents in real terms.
That is a fundamental breach of the social contract.
It is, and the decline is even steeper in certain areas, particularly the industrial Midwest places like Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, the old engines of the middle class.
So we went from a sure thing, a 90% bet, to a coin toss in just 2 generations. The immediate question has to be, why? What happened? Did the economy just stop growing? Did we stop making things?
That's the common assumption. People think, oh, GDP growth slowed down, globalization happened, there's just less pie to go around. But Chetty's analysis proves that is not the main culprit.
It's not the size of the pie.
It's not primarily about the size of the pie. The issue is the distribution of the growth. It's inequality.
So this is the rising tide lifts all boats argument just completely falling apart. The tide rose, but it only lifted the yachts.
Completely. The tide became a series of targeted jets, lifting only the biggest ships, leaving everyone else stuck in the mud. And Chetty ran a fascinating simulation to prove this. It's really clever.
What did he do?
He asked, what if we had the same somewhat lower GDP growth we have today, but we distributed it the way we did back in the 1940s and 50s.
So keeping the pie the same size as it is now, just slicing it up the way we used to, more evenly.
Exactly, more broad-based growth. And if you do that, the mobility rate jumps from 50% back up to 80%.
Wow, from 50 to 80.
That reverses 2/3 of the entire decline. It's almost entirely a distribution problem. But then he did the reverse. He ran another simulation. What if you pump up GDP growth to huge 1950s levels, but you keep today's unequal distribution?
So a much bigger pie, but sliced just as unequally as it is today.
Right. And what happens? The mobility rate barely budges. It goes from 50% to maybe 62%.
That is a staggering finding.
Right.
It means we can't just grow our way out of this problem if all that growth is only accumulating at the very top.
It's dispositive. The problem isn't the engine, it's the transmission. The power isn't getting to the wheels for most people. And this leads us to a concept that I think is essential for understanding the modern economy. It's called the Great Gatsby Curve.
I love that name. We'll definitely talk about the book later, but this is a specific economic concept. This is from the Catch a Egg research source we looked at.
Yes. The Great Gatsby Curve is basically a chart. It plots a country's inequality against its social mobility. So on one axis, you have the Gini coefficient, which is a standard measure of how unequal a country's income distribution is.
And on the other axis,
On the other, you have intergenerational mobility. How likely is a kid born poor to become a rich adult?
now what does the curve show us?
It shows a very clear, very strong correlation. The more unequal a country is, the harder it is to move up. Countries with low inequality, like Denmark or Canada, they have high mobility.
In the U.S.?
The U.S. is an outlier among rich nations. High inequality, low mobility. When the rungs on the ladder are further apart, it's just much, much harder to climb to the next one.
And the mechanisms for this aren't mysterious. It's not magic. It's about resources, right?
It's entirely about resources. Wealthy families in the U.S. invest about 7 times more in what economists call child enrichment.
Child enrichment. What does that include?
Tutors, music lessons, SAT prep courses, elite sports camps, travel, unpaid internships in expensive cities, all the things that build a resume and, build human capital.
7 times more. That's not a gap. That's a chasm.
It creates what some sociologists call a glass floor for rich kids. They can't fall too far because there's so much safety net and investment beneath them, and a sticky ceiling for poor kids.
And then you add in what Chetty calls neighborhood effects.
Exactly. Segregation, social capital. It's not just about your family's income. It's about the income of your neighbors. Where you grow up determines your economic destiny more than almost anything else. If you grow up in a neighborhood with good schools, safe parks, and connected neighbors who can get you a summer job, you rise. If you don't, you likely won't.
So the economic reality check gives us a pretty clear diagnosis. The statistical American dream, the one about upward mobility, is in critical condition. But we can't talk about the American dream without talking about who was allowed to dream it in the first place.
Exactly.
This brings us to the systemic barriers. Because the dream hasn't failed everyone equally, has it?
No, not at all. This is where we have to look at the massive race gap in the dream. And the most tangible version of the dream, the anchor of it all for most families, is homeownership.
Right. That's the nest egg. That's the retirement plan. That's the equity you borrow against to send your kid to college or start a business.
It's the primary vehicle for wealth creation for the American middle class. And we looked at data from the Urban Institute on this. And it seems like the housing market is where the legacy of the past is most visible and most damaging.
What does it show?
It's stark. Even when you control for income, age, and education, so let's say you're comparing a black family and a white family who make the same money and have the same degrees, same credit score.
So on paper, they're identical candidates for a mortgage.
On paper, identical. There is still a substantial homeownership gap.
And why is that?
Because one family likely has generational wealth for a down payment. Maybe mom and dad helped out with that 20%, which they could do because they owned a home that appreciated in value.
And the other family doesn't have that backstop.
Exactly. The white family is likely benefiting from the appreciation of their parents' and grandparents' homes, which were very likely subsidized by the GI Bill or FHA loans in the mid-century.
Loans that were explicitly denied to black families through redlining.
Systematically and explicitly denied. But it gets worse. Even when black and Hispanic families do manage to buy homes, the financial returns vary wildly based on geography.
This was the part that really frustrated me. Because buying a home is supposed to be the good financial decision. It's the standard advice everyone gives.
It is, in theory, but buying a home in a segregated, disinvested neighborhood in Cleveland or Detroit doesn't yield the same wealth appreciation as buying in a predominantly white, high-opportunity suburb of Los Angeles or Seattle.
The asset doesn't perform the same way.
Not even close. In many minority-majority neighborhoods, homes actually lose value relative to inflation, or they barely keep up. This is due to things like appraisal bias and lack of public and private investment. So even when you play the game correctly, the game is rigged by geography and demographics.
And then there's the other supposed engine of mobility, education. We tell kids, go to college, take out the loans. It's an investment in your future. It's good debt.
It's the ultimate promise, right? Education as the great equalizer.
But the data from the Heller School on the racial wealth gap just turns that completely on its head.
This was the single stat that shocked me the most in our entire stack of sources.
Yeah.
It is absolutely devastating. They looked at student borrowers 20 years after they started college.
20 years. So these people are in their late 30s or early 40s. They should be in their prime earning years.
You would think so. They should be well on their way to paying things off and building wealth. For the median white borrower, 20 years later, their debt had been reduced by 94%.
94%. Okay, so they're almost paid off. They're free and clear.
They're basically done. The investment paid off. Now, for black borrowers,
I'm bracing myself.
20 years later, the median black borrower still owes 95% of their original loan total.
Wait, 95%? After making payments for 20 years? How is that even mathematically possible?
Interest. And the labor market. Black graduates, on average, face discrimination in hiring and wages. They earn less for the very same degrees.
So their incomes are lower.
Their incomes are lower, so they are more likely to be on income-based repayment plans where their payments are smaller. So small, in fact, that they often only cover the interest or sometimes even less than the interest.
So the principal never goes down. It might even go up.
It's called negative amortization. The balance actually grows over time, even as you are diligently making payments every single month. It is horrifying.
It functions like a tax on trying to get ahead.
That's a perfect way to describe it. For white students, debt is a temporary hurdle, a bump in the road to the middle class. For many black students, it's a wealth stripper. It's a trap that lasts a lifetime. It completely undermines the narrative that education is the great equalizer.
And this aligns perfectly and, painfully with the perspective of Ta-Nehisi Coates. We look at some analysis of his work, Between the World and Me.
Coates offers a devastating critique of the dream from a totally different angle. He refuses to view it as this benign, universal aspiration.
He doesn't buy into the romance of it at all.
Not for a second. He essentially argues that the dream isn't just an innocent hope for a picket fence. He refers to those who blindly believe in it as the dreamers. And he argues that their beautiful dream requires a nightmare for other people.
He talks about the plunder. The idea that the wealth that underpins the suburban dream was built on the broken bodies of black people, through slavery, through segregation, through Jim Crow.
And he emphasizes that it's not just ancient history. We have the source from The Guardian that mentions the racial dot map of Ferguson, Missouri. You can see these stark, brutal lines of segregation.
And Coates' point is that this wasn't accidental. It wasn't just people choosing to live with their own kind.
No, it was policy. It was deliberate. Redlining, exclusionary zoning, the placement of highways. These were tools used to create ethnoburbs and ghettos and to hoard resources and opportunity in white communities.
So for Coates, the dream is a segregationist social fabric. It's an enemy of all that is real because it requires a willful ignorance. It requires ignoring the history of how that wealth was actually accumulated.
Right. If you believe the dream is purely about merit, I worked hard, so I had this nice house. You have to ignore the fact that the government subsidized white mortgages for decades while systematically denying them to black citizens. You have to ignore the plunder.
He forces us to look at the dream not as a noble goal, but as a mechanism of exclusion.
It's a myth, in his view, that allows the winners to feel righteous, to feel like they earned everything fair and square when the system was actually tooting the entire table in their favor from the start.
That's a really heavy, necessary counterpoint to that 69% optimism we started with. It forces you to ask, optimism for whom? And at whose expense?
Which brings us to how our culture actually processes these contradictions. Because, curiously, our art, our great literature and films, they've been telling us the dream is a lie for a very long time.
We've been warning ourselves about this for a century.
We have. And this is where we get to go back to high school English class. We have to talk about The Great Gatsby and Death of a Salesman.
Two absolute pillars of American literature.
And it is fascinating how often Gatsby is misunderstood, isn't it? You see Gatsby-themed parties that are all about the glitter and the champagne and the flapper dresses.
It's become this ultimate aesthetic of wealth.
Yeah.
People think it's just a fun story about rich people.
But the book is a tragedy. It's a scathing critique of the American dream. Jay Gatsby is the ultimate new money striver. He's this mysterious figure who appears out of nowhere.
And he thinks he can repeat the past.
He thinks that if he just makes enough money, which he does through bootlegging, essentially organized crime, that he can buy his way into the old money class and win Daisy back.
He thinks money erases his history, his class origins.
But it doesn't. That's Fitzgerald's entire point. The dream promised social mobility, but the reality was an impenetrable class ceiling. Gatsby amasses the fortune, he throws the extravagant parties, but he remains an outsider to the old money Buchanans. They find him vulgar.
They use him for entertainment,
Yep.
and then they discard him.
They let him take the fall for a crime he didn't commit. He dies alone in his swimming pool. The green light he was reaching for across the water, that symbol of the future, of Daisy, of the dream, it was always an illusion. It was always behind him.
It's the Great Gatsby curve in literary form.
Yeah.
The rungs were just too far apart for him to ever truly make the climb.
Exactly. And then you have Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman. If Gatsby is the tragedy of the high roller, the wannabe aristocrat, Loman is the tragedy of the little guy, the common man.
Right. Willy Loman is the guy who buys the dream hook, line, and sinker.
He's the common man who gets crushed by the law of success. He buys into a different aspect of the myth, what some call the personality ethic.
What's that?
He believes that success isn't about skills or knowledge or product quality, it's about being well-liked. He tells his sons that the key is to be popular. He thinks if he just smiles enough, shines his shoes, and hustles, the system will eventually reward him.
But the system has no loyalty to him. He's obsolete. He gets fired.
He gets chewed up and spit out. And his great failure is that he can't distinguish reality from the inside of his head. He has bought the marketing pitch so completely that he can't see that he's broken.
And it destroys him.
It destroys him and his family. Miller is showing us that the immense pressure to succeed, the constant demand of the dream, can actually destroy your mental health. Willie ends up killing himself for the insurance money. That is the ultimate commodification of the self. He believes he is worth more dead than alive.
That is so bleak. But it's interesting to trace that cultural critique forward to the cinematic evolution in the 21st century. We looked at The Pursuit of Happiness, that Will Smith movie from 2006, and compared it to The Wolf of Wall Street from 2013.
That is such a telling contrast. They're both about getting rich, but in profoundly different ways.
So what's the story in The Pursuit of Happiness?
It's the conservative dream, in a way, the noble struggle. Chris Gardner is homeless, sleeping in a subway bathroom with his young son. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But through sheer grit, incredible talent, and total submission to the corporate system, he wins an unpaid internship and becomes a stockbroker.
It validates the rags to riches possibility. It's the ultimate individualist tale. It says, see, it's hard, it's incredibly painful, but the system works if you work hard enough.
Exactly. It places the burden of success and failure entirely on the individual. If you fail, well, you just didn't work hard enough or weren't smart enough. But then you have the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort.
A very different kind of stockbroker.
He also achieves the dream. He gets the massive wealth, the yachts, the supermodel wife, the excess, but he does it through rampant fraud. He does it by robbing people blind. He does it by breaking every single rule in the book.
And the audience. I mean, the film makes him kind of charismatic. We kind of love him for it.
That's the disturbing part. The film depicts the dream in a completely decayed, amoral state. It's not about hard work or contributing to society. It's about accumulation at any cost. The debate shifts from, is the dream real, to, is the dream even moral to pursue anymore?
In Wolf, the dream is just raw, predatory greed. There's no virtue attached to it at all.
None. And speaking of moral dilemmas about work and abundance, I have to bring up the shmoo. This was a detail in one of our academic sources that I just loved. It's from the Little Abner comic strip in the 1940s.
Okay, the shmoo. Tell me about the shmoo.
Oh, the shmoo is brilliant social commentary. It's this little white blob-like creature, and its gimmick is that it lays eggs, it gives milk, and if you cook it, it tastes like steak or chicken or whatever you want it to taste like. It also multiplies rapidly.
So it's basically an unlimited free source of all life's necessities.
It is a magical abundance machine. And in the comic strip, does everyone celebrate this wonderful gift?
I'm going to guess no.
No, it
Yeah.
causes a national panic among the capitalists. The factory owners are terrified.
Why are they terrified of a cute little blob that feeds everyone?
Because if people can eat for free, if all their basic needs are met, they won't work in the factories for low wages, they won't suffer. The shmoo represents this deep fear of abundance in American culture.
It's a fear that ease undermines character.
Precisely. We have this deep-seated belief that struggle is virtuous. We believe you have to earn your living. If the dream is too easy to get, if a shmoo just gives it to you, then it's not the American dream anymore.
Which brings us all the way back to James Truslow Adams. He didn't want the dream to be about cars. He wanted it to be about character. But maybe we've fetishized the struggle part of building character a bit too much.
I think we have. We've confused suffering with virtue. And that brings us, finally, to the generational shift we are seeing right now. Because if you look at the data on millennials and Gen Z, they're starting to reject that struggle for stuff narrative. They're kind of looking for their own version of the shmoo.
We have the Independent Center poll on younger generations, and this ties back to that initial optimism paradox. The numbers are striking. 70% of millennials and Gen Z say personal fulfillment is more important than material success.
That is a massive pivot, a sea change. For boomers, the milestones were external, tangible. The house, the pension, the gold watch, the status symbols.
And for Gen Z,
For Gen Z, those things seem almost laughably out of reach anyway. Remember, they're the most pessimistic about the dream being attainable. They acknowledge that traditional milestones were easier for boomers, so they are rewriting the script entirely.
they're saying, if I can't have the house with the picket fence, I'm going to have a life I actually enjoy.
Precisely. They value flexibility, they value entrepreneurship, they're optimistic about their ability to create their own paths. They are using the tools of the modern economy, remote work, the gig economy, Uber, Etsy, being a digital nomad to craft a lifestyle.
A lifestyle that prioritizes freedom of choice over the slow, steady corporate ladder climb.
It's a new dream. It's less about accumulation and more about autonomy. The new mantra is, I might not own a home, but I own my time.
And here is where it gets really interesting. If you go back to James Truslow Adams in 1931, his phrase, a life better, richer, and fuller, this Gen Z definition might actually be closer to his original intent than the boomer definition ever was.
It's a fantastic point. Adams wanted people to be full, not just rich. He was talking about the richness of experience and intellect.
So we've come full circle. The Gen Z influencer working from a laptop in Bali is actually the spiritual successor to the 1930s historian worrying about the soul of America.
In a strange way, yes. And the Archbridge Institute, the same people who gave us that optimism data, calls this the economics of flourishing.
The economics of flourishing versus the psychology of flourishing.
Exactly. And they found that Americans now rank freedom of choice in how to live at 83% and having a good family life at 80% as being essential to the dream.
And what about becoming wealthy?
That has dropped to only 15%.
15%.
It has plummeted. Being rich is now a niche interest, apparently.
So the dream isn't dying. It's just shedding its skin. It's shedding its materialism, maybe out of necessity, maybe out of choice.
Or perhaps it's adapting to survival mode. That's the more cynical take, right? If you can't afford the material trappings of the old dream, you find value in the experiential ones. It's a bit of a defense mechanism. I didn't want those grapes anyway. They were probably sour.
I see that. But you think it's deeper.
I think it's deeper than just that. I think there is a genuine cultural shift away from the Wolf of Wall Street excess toward a desire for meaning. People are realizing that the rat race has no finish line, and the prize isn't that great anyway.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize all of this. We have a lot of moving parts here, a lot of conflicting signals.
We do. On one hand, we have the statistical American dream. This is the absolute mobility numbers from Chetty, the hard data.
Yeah.
That dream is in critical condition.
It's failing.
The escalator is broken, and it's especially broken if you are Black or if you're living in the Rust Belt. Systemic barriers like student debt and the housing gap are real, they are persistent, and they are math-based. You can't just wish them away.
But on the other hand, we have the psychological American dream, the feeling.
And that is surprisingly, stubbornly resilient. 69% of people still believe they are making progress. But, and this is the key, they are redefining what progress looks like. They are shifting the goalposts from wealth to fulfillment and freedom.
It's almost like the dream is a virus that mutates to survive. The host environment, The economy changed. It became harsher, more unequal. So the virus changed its structure. It stopped trying to kill the host with overwork and started trying to live symbiotically through experiences and flexibility.
That's a great, if slightly biological way to put it. The spirit of the dream survives by detaching itself from the harsh economic reality.
But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. If the new dream is freedom of choice and personal fulfillment, doesn't that still cost money? A lot of money.
Yeah. That is the big question. That is the elephant in the room. You can't have freedom of choice if you are drowning in student debt. You can't have personal fulfillment if you are working 3 gig economy jobs just to pay rent and you have no health insurance.
Right. Flexibility can sound a lot like instability if you're broke. The freedom to drive an Uber for 12 hours a day isn't the same as the freedom of a trust fund.
Not even remotely. And this leads me to a final provocative thought for our listeners to mull over. James Truslow Adams wanted a social order where everyone could attain their fullest stature.
A baseline of security.
Yes, exactly. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You need food and shelter and safety before you can even think about self-actualization.
And if our current system creates vast inequality, that great Gatsby curve we talked about,
Mm.
where the rich hoard opportunity and the poor are trapped by their zip code.
Then are we really living the American dream? I think we might be living in the inverse of the American dream. Even if we feel optimistic, even if we tell ourselves we value experiences over stuff, if the structural reality prevents social mobility for half the population, then the dream becomes a kind of sedative.
A sedative, how so?
It becomes a drug, a story we tell ourselves to endure a system that isn't working for most of us. It keeps us docile. It keeps us focused on our own individual hustle instead of the collective problem. It keeps us chasing the shmoo that doesn't really exist.
So it keeps us from demanding we fix the broken escalator. Because if we think we can just mindset our way up the stairs, we don't demand policy change.
Precisely. And if freedom of choice is the new currency of the dream, we have to ask a very hard question. Who can actually afford to buy it? Is freedom itself becoming a luxury good, just like the white picket fence used to be?
That is something to chew on. The American dream. Battered, bruised, mutating, but still the ghost in the machine of our society. It seems we need to decide if we want to keep dreaming or if it's finally time to wake up and fix the bed we're all sleeping in.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.